Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. Evelyn Carter's peaceful life on her sprawling ranch seemed unshakable. But beneath the quiet veneer lay secrets of a past few dared to imagine. Once a relentless federal marshal known only as the Ghost, Evelyn had dismantled criminal empires without a single shot. Now, shadows are creeping back into her life. When a ruthless gang begins closing in on her town, Evelyn must decide whether to embrace the darkness she once escaped. What she uncovers is far more sinister than anyone could have anticipated. A conspiracy so vast that it threatens to unravel the world as she knows it. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey coming tomorrow. The sound of boots echoed in the dimly lit corridor. Evelyn Carter moved with precision. Her gun holstered but her hand brushing it lightly. Poised for action. Her breath was steady. Her focus absolute. Ahead lay her target, a high-ranking operative whose capture would unravel an international trafficking ring. The air was thick with tension, and Evelyn felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. In and out, she whispered to herself. Her voice as calm as her nerves were sharp. Her reputation as the Phantom was well-earned. A federal marshal who operated with surgical precision. She had taken down 27 high-profile targets without collateral damage. Her methods were legendary. Her ability to outmaneuver her enemies unparalleled. Tonight was no different. The door ahead creaked open, spilling a sliver of light into the hallway. A man stepped out, a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Evelyn's eyes locked onto him, calculating his movements. She moved swiftly, disarming him before he could react. Within seconds, the man was immobilized, his briefcase secure in her grasp. Another flawless takedown. Before the man could utter a word, the scene shifted. The memory dissolved like smoke. Evelyn Carter blinked, her hand tightening around a ceramic coffee mug. The soft hues of dawn spilled over the rolling hills of her ranch. Birds chirped in the distance, and the smell of fresh hay mingled with the crisp morning air. She was home. 7 years had passed since she retired from her life as a marshal. 7 years of quiet mornings, feeding horses, and walking the perimeter of the ranch she shared with her husband, Thomas Carter. It was a life of simplicity, one she had chosen deliberately. But as much as she tried, Evelyn couldn't fully let go of her past. Peace, she knew, was fragile. Something's not right. Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood near the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His weathered face carried the lines of decades spent working the land. But today it was etched with worry. Evelyn rose from the porch steps, her mug still warm in her hand. "What is it?" she asked, her tone measured but alert. "The black vultures," he said, nodding toward the dirt road that bordered their property. "I saw a couple of their bikes in town yesterday. Word is, they've set up a chapter north of here." The name sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She'd read about the Black Vultures in the news, a notorious biker gang linked to extortion, trafficking, and violent crimes. Wherever they appeared, trouble followed. "They've never been this far west before," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with unease. "Why here?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She set her mug down on the porch railing and scanned the horizon. The early sunlight cast long shadows across the pastures, but her eyes were fixed on the road. "It's not about the place," she said finally. "It's about opportunity. Something brought them here." Thomas studied her face, his brow furrowing. He knew Evelyn had a past, though she rarely spoke of it. He'd pieced together enough to understand her instincts were sharper than most. Her judgment nearly infallible. He didn't question her words. "You think they'll come this way?" he asked. Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "If they think we're in their way, they will." The weight of her statement hung in the air. 4 years. They had worked to build a life here. A sanctuary far from the chaos she once faced. But Evelyn knew better than anyone that safety was never guaranteed. That evening, Evelyn took her usual walk along the perimeter of the ranch. The fading sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. In the distance, sounds of crickets began to fill the air. To anyone else, the scene might have seemed idyllic. But Evelyn's sharp eyes scanned for anything out of place. She had learned long ago to read the subtle signs of trouble: disturbed soil, tracks where there shouldn't be, cigarette butts left by intruders. Tonight, everything seemed untouched. But the unease in her chest didn't fade. As she reached the edge of the property, she paused to look out at the dirt road. It stretched like a ribbon across the land, disappearing into the horizon. Her mind wandered to Thomas's words. The black vultures didn't settle somewhere without a reason. When she returned to the house, Thomas was at the kitchen table, a map spread out in front of him. "Planning something?" Evelyn asked, hanging her hat by the door. He glanced up with a faint smile. "Just trying to be prepared." Evelyn joined him, her gaze falling on the map. It detailed the surrounding area, with roads and landmarks carefully marked. She traced a finger along one of the routes. "If they've set up north, they'll want control of this road," she said. "It's the easiest way to the highway." Thomas nodded. "You think they'll come for it?" "It's possible," Evelyn replied. "But if they do, we'll be ready." Her words were calm, but her mind was already running through scenarios, planning for contingencies. She had spent years outthinking dangerous people. And if the black vultures thought they could intimidate her, they were in for a rude awakening. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. Evelyn Carter walked the perimeter of the property, her boots crunching softly against the dirt path. Her keen eyes scanned her surroundings, picking up on every detail. It was second nature now, a habit born from years of staying one step ahead of dangerous people. A slight depression in the ground caught her attention. She knelt, brushing her fingers across the disturbed soil. It could have been an animal, but Evelyn's instincts told her otherwise. Nearby, a faint tread mark, barely visible in the fading light, confirmed her suspicions. Someone had been here recently. She rose slowly, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Evelyn's vigilance wasn't rooted in paranoia, it was a learned necessity. Trouble didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept in quietly, leaving subtle clues for those sharp enough to notice. Satisfied that the immediate area was clear, she continued her circuit. The horses in the nearby paddock stirred, their ears twitching as she passed. Evelyn offered a reassuring murmur, her presence calming the animals. By the time she completed her round and returned to the house, the stars had begun to blanket the sky. Inside, Thomas was finishing up dinner preparations. The scent of roasted vegetables and baked bread filled the kitchen. Evelyn removed her hat, setting it on the rack by the door. "No sign of anything unusual," she said, though her tone carried a hint of uncertainty. Thomas looked up, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Let's hope it stays that way." The following morning, Evelyn drove into Providence Springs. The small town bustled with quiet activity, its streets lined with locally owned shops and cafes. She parked her truck outside the general store and stepped inside, her basket quickly filling with supplies, feed for the horses, a new pair of gloves for Thomas, and a few pantry staples. As she loaded her purchases into the truck bed, the rumble of motorcycle engines drew her attention. A group of bikers had parked outside the diner across the street. Their leather jackets bore the emblem of the Black Vulture's MC, a skeletal raven clutching a red scythe. They laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the lot. Evelyn's gaze lingered on them, her posture casual but her mind alert. She observed their interactions, noting the dominant figure in the group, a tall man with a shaved head and a confident swagger. He seemed to command the others, his body language radiating authority. One of the bikers noticed her. He elbowed his companion, and the two turned to look in her direction. Their smirks carried a hint of challenge. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She gave them a polite nod, climbed into her truck, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of the group. The tall man was watching her, his expression unreadable. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, but Evelyn's thoughts were anything but. The presence of the Black Vultures in town was more than an inconvenience, it was a warning. They weren't just passing through. They were settling in. And sooner or later, their activities would bleed into the surrounding areas. That evening, Evelyn and Thomas sat on the porch, the sun setting behind them. A cool breeze rustled the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and hay. Thomas sipped his coffee, his brow furrowed as he stared out at the horizon. "I saw them today," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "The Black Vultures. A group of them at the diner." Thomas set his mug down, his jaw tightening. "How many?" "5, she replied. "Maybe 6. They weren't trying to hide who they were." He nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. "They're making themselves comfortable. That's not a good sign." "No, it's not," Evelyn agreed. Thomas looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you think they'll come out here?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "It's hard to say. They'll start small, getting a feel for the town, figuring out who's worth targeting. If they think the ranch is valuable, they might try." Thomas exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "We've worked too hard to let them take anything from us. And they won't," Evelyn said firmly. "But we need to be ready. They'll test the waters before making any big moves. We have to stay ahead of them." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between them. As the last light faded, Thomas rose and headed inside. Evelyn stayed on the porch, her eyes scanning the darkness. Later that night, Evelyn remained awake, sitting by the window with a rifle resting against the wall nearby. The ranch was quiet. The only sounds the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the soft nickering of the horses. But Evelyn's mind was anything but quiet. She thought about the bikers, their cocky smiles and the way they had watched her. She thought about the tracks she had seen near the perimeter of the ranch. And she thought about the countless times she had faced down threats far more dangerous than this. Her resolve was unshakable. If the Black Vultures thought they could intimidate her, they were mistaken. Evelyn Carter hadn't survived years as the Phantom by backing down from a challenge. She wouldn't start now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Evelyn Carter wiped her hands on a rag and stepped out of the barn. The faint sound of an approaching engine drifted through the air, growing louder with each passing second. She turned toward the dirt road, her sharp eyes narrowing as a sleek black SUV came into view, kicking up a trail of dust behind it. Evelyn's grip on the rag tightened. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and uninvited ones even more so. She walked toward the house, the weight of her past experience grounding her every step. as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the front porch. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. "Mrs. Carter, I presume," he called out, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of authority. Evelyn nodded, her expression guarded. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Vincent Romano. A pleasure to meet you." Romano extended a hand, but Evelyn didn't take it. Instead, she crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "What brings you out here, Mr. Romano?" He let his hand drop, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with a casual air. Straight to the point. "I like that. You see, I represent certain interests in the area. We're expanding our operations, and your ranch happens to be in a prime location." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Expanding your operations? Sounds vague." Romano chuckled softly, the sound cold and calculated. "It's simple. Really. I'm offering to buy your property, at a price well above market value. I might add." Evelyn's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but her eyes remained unreadable. "And why would you do that?" "The land's not for sale." Romano took a step closer, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Because I believe in fair deals. Mrs. Carter, I'm sure you and your husband would find the offer persuasive." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, feigning a thoughtful expression. "That's generous of you, Mr. Romano. But like I said, the land's not for sale." The smile on Romano's face faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably," he said, his tone hardening. "It would be a shame if things got complicated." Evelyn's heart quickened, but her exterior remained calm. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Is that a threat, Mr. Romano?" Romano met her gaze, his smile returning, though it was now laced with menace. "Not at all. Just a piece of friendly advice. Things can get messy when people refuse to cooperate." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Then, Evelyn stepped back, her demeanor shifting. She allowed her shoulders to slump slightly, adopting the posture of someone intimidated but resigned. "Well, I'll have to discuss this with my husband," she said, her voice quieter now. "We'll get back to you." Romano's smile widened. "That's all I ask. Take your time. But don't take too long. These offers have a way of disappearing." With that, he turned and walked back to the SUV. Evelyn watched as the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road, her expression unreadable. When the dust settled, she turned and walked inside the house, her mind already racing. Inside, Thomas was at the kitchen table, sorting through a pile of paperwork. He looked up as Evelyn entered, his brow furrowing at the sight of her tense expression. "Who was that?" he asked. "Vincent Romano," she replied, sitting down across from him. "Said he wants to buy the ranch." Thomas frowned. "Why? What does he want with our land?" Evelyn leaned forward, lowering her voice. "It's not just about the land. He's connected to the Black Vultures." Thomas's eyes widened. "The gang? How do you know?" "I've seen his face before," Evelyn said, her tone steady. "Back when I was still with the Marshals. He's not just some businessman. He's involved in trafficking, extortion, and who knows what else. The Black Vultures are his muscle." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his worry evident. "So what do we do?" "We can't let him push us out." "We won't. Evelyn said firmly. But we need to be smart about this. He's testing us. Seeing how far he can push. If we show weakness, he'll come back with more than just an offer. Thomas nodded slowly. His trust in Evelyn clear. What's the plan? Evelyn's mind was already working, piecing together a strategy. First, we need to make sure the ranch is secure. Check the locks, reinforce the gates, and keep an eye on the perimeter. If they try anything, we need to be ready. Thomas nodded, but his concern lingered. And what about you? If Romano knows who you are? Evelyn met his gaze, her expression resolute. Then he's underestimated me. The next morning, Evelyn walked the perimeter of the ranch again. Her movements deliberate and precise. She checked the gates, examined the tracks near the road, and made mental notes of any potential vulnerabilities. Her years of experience had taught her to anticipate danger before it arrived. As she returned to the house, she noticed Thomas standing on the porch, his phone in hand. He waved her over, his expression grim. Just got a call from town, he said. Romano's been asking questions about us. Talking to some of the locals. Evelyn's jaw tightened. What kind of questions? Trying to figure out who we are. What we've got here. Thomas said. Nothing too specific, but enough to make people uneasy. Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. Romano wasn't wasting any time. He was probing, looking for weaknesses. But she had dealt with men like him before. The key was to stay one step ahead. As the day wore on, Evelyn and Thomas worked together to secure the ranch. They reinforced the gates, installed new locks, and set up a system of motion-activated lights around the property. Evelyn even dusted off an old hunting rifle, cleaning and loading it with practiced ease. By the time the sun set, the ranch was as secure as they could make it. Evelyn stood on the porch, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The night was quiet, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Inside, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, a map spread out before him. Evelyn joined him, her gaze falling on the markings he had made. If they come, they'll come from here, she said, pointing to a narrow road that led to the main highway. It's the easiest access point. Thomas nodded. And if they try to intimidate us? Evelyn's expression hardened. Then we make it clear they picked the wrong target. As the hours passed, Evelyn's mind kept returning to Romano's visit. His polished demeanor and veiled threats had been designed to unsettle her. But they had only sharpened her resolve. She knew his type, men who thrived on fear and manipulation. But Evelyn Carter wasn't easily intimidated. Before heading to bed, she double-checked the locks and walked through the house, her senses on high alert. As she stood by the window, staring out at the dark expanse of the ranch, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. Romano thought he had the upper hand, but he had underestimated her. Evelyn knew more about him than he realized, and she would use that knowledge to her advantage. The first threat had been made, but the battle was far from over. Evelyn Carter leaned against the hood of her truck, a pair of binoculars in her hands, parked on a dirt road just outside of town. She had a clear view of the diner where the Black Vultures MC congregated. The bikers lounged outside, their laughter and loud voices carrying on the wind. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a casual gathering. But Evelyn knew better. Every movement, every exchange, carried a purpose. She had spent years watching criminals operate, and these men weren't any different. She adjusted the binoculars, focusing on the tall man she'd identified as Vincent Romano's lieutenant. He leaned against his motorcycle, gesturing as he spoke to two others. Evelyn studied his body language, noting the casual authority with which he gave orders. The others listened intently, nodding before splitting off. One headed toward the gas station across the street. The other disappeared around the corner. Evelyn's gaze followed the second man, her mind piecing together the puzzle. Over the past week, she had tracked their movements across town. The gang frequented specific locations: the diner, a warehouse near the train yard, and a rundown motel on the outskirts. It was clear they weren't just passing through, they were establishing a foothold. Her observations painted a picture of a well-organized operation. The bikers moved with precision, their actions coordinated. Supplies were delivered to the warehouse late at night, and she had spotted unmarked vans leaving in the early hours. The motel served as a hub, with new faces arriving regularly. This wasn't the work of a few rowdy bikers, this was something much larger. Evelyn lowered the binoculars and climbed back into her truck. Her instincts told her to dig deeper, but she knew better than to rush. Patience had always been her greatest ally, and it would be here too. For now, she needed to maintain her cover and gather more information. Later that day, Evelyn made her way to the town clinic. It was a small, unassuming building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. She pushed open the door, greeted by the faint smell of antiseptic. The waiting room was quiet, save for the soft hum of a ceiling fan. "Mrs. Carter," a familiar voice called out. Dr. Joseph Bennett emerged from the back, his kind eyes lighting up as he saw her. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a steady demeanor that put his patients at ease. "Dr. Bennett," Evelyn said, offering a small smile. "Thought I'd stop by and pick up a few things." "Of course," he replied, gesturing for her to follow him to the back. "What can I get you today?" Evelyn glanced around as they walked, her sharp eyes taking in the details of the clinic. It was clean and orderly, but she noticed the faint lines of stress on Dr. Bennett's face. He looked more tired than usual. "Just some basic supplies," Evelyn said. "Bandages, antiseptic, maybe a few extras for the first aid kit. You know how it is on the ranch." Dr. Bennett nodded as he gathered the items. "Anything else I can help you with?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Actually, I was wondering if you've noticed anything unusual around town lately. Any new patients? Visitors?" The doctor paused, his hands resting on the counter. He looked at her carefully, as though weighing his words. "You mean the bikers?" Evelyn nodded. "They've been making themselves known." Dr. Bennett sighed, leaning against the counter. "A few of them have been in here. Cuts, bruises, nothing too serious. They're not exactly the polite type, but they haven't caused trouble yet." "In the warehouse?" Evelyn asked. Dr. Bennett's brow furrowed. "I've seen deliveries. Late at night. Mostly. No idea what's in the trucks, but it's been more frequent in the past few days." Evelyn nodded, absorbing the information. "Thanks. Document. You've been a big help." Dr. Bennett gave her a small smile. "Be careful, Evelyn. These people aren't the type to play fair." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm watching." As Evelyn left the clinic, she crossed the street to the diner. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was half empty. She slid into a booth near the window, ordering a coffee and keeping her gaze on the parking lot outside. It wasn't long before the door opened, and a young man in a leather jacket stepped in. His gang emblem was smaller than the others she had seen, marking him as a prospect. He couldn't have been older than 25, his face still carrying traces of youth. He looked around nervously before sitting at the counter. Evelyn watched as he ordered a meal, his hands fidgeting as he waited. There was something about him that caught her attention. Unlike the others, who carried themselves with confidence, this one seemed out of place. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting around the room as though he expected trouble. Evelyn studied him carefully, filing away every detail. The way he hesitated before speaking to the waitress, the way he avoided eye contact with the other patrons. This was someone with doubts, someone who didn't fully belong. Her coffee arrived, and she sipped it slowly, her mind already forming a plan. If this young man had reservations about his role in the gang, he could be useful. But for now, she would observe. The time to act would come soon enough. The diner buzzed softly with the hum of low conversation and clinking silverware. Evelyn Carter sat in the same corner booth as the day before, her coffee untouched as her sharp eyes observed every detail. Across the room, the young man she had identified as James sat at the counter. His unease was palpable, the kind of nervous energy that made him fidget with the silverware and glance over his shoulder too often. Two older bikers entered, their boots heavy against the tile floor. They were part of the Black Vultures, their jackets marked with senior ranks, and they walked with the kind of swagger that came from years of asserting dominance. They spotted James immediately, moving to sit on either side of him at the counter. Their postures were relaxed, but Evelyn could see the tension in James' shoulders as they began speaking to him in low, firm tones. James nodded at first, his face tight as he listened. One of the bikers leaned in closer, tapping a finger against the counter for emphasis. James' hands gripped the edge of his plate, his knuckles whitening. Whatever they were discussing wasn't optional, and James was struggling to mask his reluctance. Evelyn watched, her mind calculating. This wasn't the first time she'd seen someone under pressure. But James' demeanor intrigued her. He wasn't just a nervous recruit, there was doubt in his eyes. Doubt, Evelyn knew, could be a powerful tool. As the bikers stood to leave, James remained at the counter, staring down at his half-eaten meal. Evelyn waited a moment before rising and approaching casually, her movements smooth and unthreatening. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the stool beside him. James looked up, startled, but he nodded. "Sure." Evelyn slid onto the stool, signaling the waitress for a refill of her coffee. She took a sip, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "Tough crowd," she said, her tone light but deliberate. James glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "Those guys," Evelyn said, nodding toward the door. "They're not exactly subtle. Must be hard keeping up with that kind of pressure." James hesitated, his eyes darting to the door before settling on his plate. "It's fine. Just part of the job." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Everyone's got their limits. Sometimes it's not about how much you can take, it's about knowing when to walk away." He looked at her then, something flickering in his expression. Curiosity? Suspicion? Evelyn couldn't tell yet, but she'd planted the seed. She finished her coffee and stood, leaving a bill on the counter. "Take care, James," she said as she walked away. His head snapped up, but she didn't look back. Later that evening, Evelyn parked her truck near the edge of the warehouse district. The area was quiet, the streets lit by dim, flickering lamps. She'd followed one of the Black Vultures vans here the night before, and now she wanted to see what was inside. Keeping to the shadows, Evelyn made her way to the side of the warehouse. The building was large and nondescript, with no signage to indicate its purpose. A chain-link fence surrounded the lot, but Evelyn had already scoped out a weak point in its structure. She slipped through easily, her movements silent and deliberate. She approached a stack of crates near the loading dock, crouching low as she listened for any signs of activity. The muffled sound of voices came from inside the building, but the lot itself was empty. Evelyn pulled a small flashlight from her pocket. Its beam narrowed as she examined the crates. Each one was marked with a generic shipping company logo. But when she pried open the lid of one, its contents told a different story. Inside were rows of carefully packed rifles, their sleek barrels glinting faintly in the light. Evelyn's breath caught. This wasn't just a gang stockpiling weapons for intimidation. This was an arsenal meant for something far larger. She moved to another crate, cracking it open to reveal boxes of ammunition. A third contained communications equipment, the kind used for secure transmissions. Evelyn's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. The Black Vultures weren't just operating on their own. They were part of a larger network, one with significant resources and reach. A sound behind her made her freeze. Footsteps. Evelyn slipped behind the stack of crates, her hand instinctively reaching for her knife. Two men emerged from the warehouse, their conversation low but heated. "Romano's pushing hard," one of them said. "He wants everything ready by next week." "Doesn't make sense," the other replied. "Why rush it? We've been laying low for months. Why change now?" "Don't know. But orders are orders. He's got someone big pulling the strings. We just follow through." Evelyn stayed perfectly still, her mind absorbing every word. The mention of someone higher up confirmed her suspicions. Romano wasn't the top of the chain. There was someone else, someone more dangerous, behind all of this. When the men moved back inside, Evelyn slipped away, retracing her steps and making her way back to the truck. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the gravity of what she'd uncovered. The Black Vultures weren't just a nuisance. They were a cog in a much larger machine. Back at the ranch, Evelyn spread out her notes and photographs on the kitchen table. She documented everything: the crates, the weapons, the overheard conversation. It all pointed to a carefully orchestrated operation with international ties. Thomas entered, his expression wary as he took in the spread of evidence. "What did you find?" "Everything," Evelyn said, her tone grim. "Weapons, equipment, intel. The Black Vultures aren't just running this on their own. They're part of something much bigger." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And Romano? He's a middleman," Evelyn replied. "There's someone above him calling the shots. Someone with the power to move this kind of operation." The weight of her discovery settled over them, the stakes clearer than ever. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing ahead. "We can't take this lightly," she said. "This isn't just about protecting the ranch anymore. This is bigger than us." Thomas nodded, his trust in her evident. "What's the next move?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed, determination hardening her features. "We find out who's pulling the strings, and we take them down." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel. It means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The sun hung low over Providence Springs as Evelyn Carter parked her truck in front of Dr. Bennett's clinic. The usually quiet street seemed subdued, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Evelyn stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel, and glanced around. The Black Vultures had been making more frequent appearances in town, and today was no different. As she entered the clinic, the sharp smell of antiseptic hit her. Dr. Bennett looked up from his desk, relief flashing across his face when he saw her. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a mix of welcome and concern. "Good timing. We might have a problem." Evelyn closed the door behind her. "What's going on?" Dr. Bennett gestured toward the back room. "3 of them came in not long ago. Wanted me to patch up one of their guys. Said it was an accident. But the injuries," he shook his head. "It's not adding up. They're still here." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Where?" "Exam room 2. Dr. Bennett said, lowering his voice. "I didn't want to argue with them. But they've been acting like they own the place." Evelyn nodded, her mind already calculating. "Stay here," she instructed. "I'll handle it." The door to exam room 2 was slightly ajar. Evelyn approached silently, her steps measured. Peering through the gap, she saw 2 bikers standing against the wall, their arms crossed, while a third sat on the exam table. His arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked towel, his face twisted in pain. The 2 standing men were relaxed but alert, their eyes scanning the room. Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped inside. The men's heads snapped toward her, their postures stiffening at the sight of her. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded, his voice sharp. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her gaze sweep over the room, taking in every detail. Finally, she locked eyes with the speaker. Someone who doesn't appreciate bullies in her town. The injured man let out a pained laugh. "Bullies? Lady, we're just here for some medical attention. No need to get all righteous. Medical attention doesn't usually come with intimidation," Evelyn said coolly, her tone razor sharp. "Why don't you explain why you're really here?" The second man pushed off the wall, stepping forward. He was taller than Evelyn. His presence meant to intimidate. "Listen, lady, we don't have time for this. How about you mind your business and let the doc finish up?" Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her stance steady and unyielding. "And how about you explain why your buddy here looks like he's been on the losing end of a bar fight?" The room grew tense. The taller man's eyes narrowed, and his hand drifted toward his belt. Evelyn noticed the motion and acted instantly. In a blur, she stepped forward, her hand snapping out to grip his wrist. With a swift twist, she forced his hand away from the knife holstered at his hip. He let out a grunt of pain as Evelyn maintained her grip. "That's not a good idea," she said, her voice low and firm. The other standing biker moved toward her, but Evelyn shifted her weight, releasing the first man and stepping back, her hand hovering near her own belt. The subtle threat stopped them both in their tracks. "We're done here," Evelyn said. "Take your friend and go." The injured man glanced at his companions, then back at Evelyn. "What's your deal?" "Huh? You don't even know us." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough. And I know this isn't your last stop. So save yourself the trouble and leave now." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The taller man rubbed his wrist, glaring at Evelyn. But he didn't move to attack again. Finally, the injured man swung his legs off the table, wincing as he stood. "Let's go," he muttered. The 3 of them moved toward the door, their movements tense. Evelyn stepped aside, her eyes following them until they disappeared down the hall. She waited until she heard the front door of the clinic slam shut before relaxing her stance. Dr. Bennett emerged from the back room, his face pale. "What just happened?" "They won't bother you again," Evelyn said, her tone even. Dr. Bennett shook his head. "Evelyn, they'll be back. You know they will. Not if I make it clear this town isn't worth their trouble," Evelyn replied. Dr. Bennett frowned, concern etched across his features. "You're taking a big risk, standing up to them like this." Evelyn met his gaze. her expression resolute. "Someone has to. And besides," she added, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "this is only the beginning." The streets outside the clinic were quiet as Evelyn climbed into her truck. She watched the retreating figures of the bikers as they mounted their motorcycles and roared off into the distance. Her mind was already working, planning her next move. The Black Vultures were testing their boundaries, and Evelyn knew they wouldn't stop until someone forced them to. As she drove back to the ranch, the weight of her decision settled over her. Passive observation was no longer an option. It was time to take the fight to them. Evelyn Carter sat in her truck under the cover of darkness, her sharp eyes fixed on the Miller warehouse. The large, weathered structure sat at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown grass and dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights. It had become a focal point of the Black Vultures' operations, with vehicles coming and going at odd hours. Evelyn had spent days observing their patterns, documenting every detail. Through her binoculars, she watched a group of bikers unloading crates from a delivery truck. The crates bore nondescript logos, but the secrecy surrounding their transport told Evelyn they weren't ordinary shipments. Two men stood guard near the entrance, their postures tense, while another directed the unloading process. Evelyn noted their efficient movements and the careful handling of the cargo. A car pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A tall man stepped out, and Evelyn immediately recognized him as Vincent Romano's lieutenant. He exchanged brief words with the bikers, gesturing toward the warehouse. They nodded and carried the crates inside, disappearing through the large metal doors. Evelyn's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Whatever was happening here wasn't small time. The Black Vultures were part of something far more intricate. She reached for her notebook, jotting down her observations. The coded patterns of movement, the specific times of activity, and the cautious yet purposeful interactions all pointed to a coordinated operation. This wasn't a gang simply smuggling goods for profit, this was logistics at a professional level. Evelyn's gut told her that these shipments were linked to something much larger, and she intended to find out exactly what. Hours later, the lot fell silent. The truck had left, and the bikers had retreated inside. Evelyn knew this was her opportunity. She slid out of her truck, her movements deliberate and silent. Dressed in dark clothing and armed with her tactical gear, she approached the warehouse perimeter, sticking to the shadows. The chain-link fence surrounding the property had a weak point she'd scouted earlier. She slipped through, careful not to disturb the loose metal. As she crept closer, she scanned for security cameras. A single camera pointed toward the main entrance, its slow sweep predictable. Evelyn waited for it to turn away before darting to the side of the building. The warehouse door was locked, as she had expected. From her pocket, she pulled a small toolkit and began working on the lock. Years of training and experience made her movements swift and precise. Within moments, the lock clicked open, and she slipped inside. The air inside was cool and smelled of oil and metal. Rows of shelves filled the space, stacked with crates and equipment. Evelyn moved cautiously, her flashlight casting a narrow beam. She avoided the center of the room, sticking to the edges where she could blend into the shadows. She reached a set of crates marked with the same logo she'd seen earlier. Carefully prying one open, she found rows of neatly packed firearms, their serial numbers filed off. Another crate contained sophisticated communication equipment, satellite phones, encrypted radios, and laptops. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just smuggling, this was outfitting a larger network. Evelyn's flashlight landed on a stack of papers tucked inside one of the crates. She pulled them out and flipped through them quickly. The documents were coded, But certain details stood out: lists of shipments, contact names, and locations scattered across multiple countries. One phrase appeared repeatedly: Shadow Council. Her breath caught. She'd heard whispers of the Shadow Council during her time as a marshal. A covert organization operating above national jurisdictions, pulling strings to manipulate global events. If the Black Vultures were connected to them, this operation was more dangerous than she had imagined. She stuffed the papers into her bag and moved to a nearby desk. A computer hummed softly. Its screen locked. Evelyn retrieved a flash drive from her pocket and inserted it into the machine, initiating a program to copy the files. As the progress bar crept forward, her ears caught the faint sound of voices outside. Evelyn's heart raced as she realized the gang members were returning. She quickly pocketed the flash drive and turned off the computer. Moving swiftly, she retraced her steps, heading toward the exit. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the sound of boots on gravel. She slipped behind a stack of crates, holding her breath as the warehouse door creaked open. Two bikers entered, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Evelyn crouched low, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. The men's footsteps echoed as they moved deeper into the warehouse, their conversation muffled but tense. "Romano's not gonna like it if we're late again," one of them muttered. "Yeah. Well, maybe he shouldn't schedule pickups in the middle of the night," the other replied. Evelyn seized the moment and moved quietly toward the exit. The door was still slightly ajar, and she slipped through, careful not to let it creak. Once outside, she darted to the fence and climbed through the weak point she had used earlier. Back in her truck, Evelyn allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She glanced at the bag beside her, filled with the papers and flash drive. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and what she had uncovered was bigger than anything she had faced before. As she drove away from the warehouse, her mind raced with possibilities. The Black Vultures weren't just a local gang causing trouble. They were pawns in a global operation, orchestrated by an unseen force. The Shadow Council was real, and their reach extended far beyond Providence Springs. Evelyn's determination hardened. She wasn't just fighting to protect her town anymore. She was stepping into a much larger battle, one that would require every skill and ounce of resolve she had. The stakes had never been higher. Evelyn Carter crouched low behind a stack of crates outside the Miller warehouse, her eyes fixed on the dimly lit entrance. A black van pulled into the lot, its headlights sweeping the area before shutting off. The driver's door opened, and out stepped James, the gang prospect she had been observing. His movements were hurried but hesitant, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an unseen weight. Two senior Black Vultures exited the back of the van, exchanging a few words with James before handing him a clipboard and gesturing toward the loading dock. Evelyn adjusted her position to get a better view. James moved to the rear of the van, pulling out a crate and placing it on a dolly. His hands fumbled slightly, and he paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to reprimand him. The senior bikers were engrossed in their conversation, their backs turned to him. Evelyn's keen instincts picked up on the subtle tells: the way James avoided eye contact, the nervous energy in his movements. He was out of place here, and he knew it. She watched as he wheeled the crate into the warehouse, his steps faltering when the bikers barked a reminder to hurry. This was the moment she had been waiting for. James's hesitation wasn't just fear, it was conflict. He was grappling with something deeper, and Evelyn saw an opportunity to exploit that doubt. When James re-emerged from the warehouse, Evelyn was ready. She stepped out of the shadows, her movements measured and deliberate. "James," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. He froze, his eyes darting around the lot before landing on her. His expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low but tense. Evelyn took a step closer, her hands raised slightly to show she meant no harm. "Someone who's been watching. Someone who sees more than you think." James's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here. Neither should you," Evelyn replied, her tone calm but firm. "This isn't who you are, James. I can see it. You don't belong with them." He stiffened, his grip tightening on the clipboard he still held. "You don't know me." "Maybe not," Evelyn admitted. "But I can see the doubt in your eyes. The way you hesitate when they give you orders. The way you look over your shoulder like you're waiting for an out." James glanced toward the warehouse entrance, his unease growing. "You've got the wrong idea," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do I? Then tell me. James, why do you stay? Is it loyalty? Fear? Or are you just too deep to see a way out?" Her words seemed to strike a chord. James's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "It never is," Evelyn agreed. "But you have a choice. You don't have to let them decide who you are or what you become." James turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Why do you care?" he asked. "Because I've seen where this road leads," Evelyn said, her tone heavy with experience. "And I know you're better than this. You have a chance to change things. James, don't waste it." Before he could respond, a voice shouted from the warehouse entrance. "James, what's taking so long?" He stiffened, his head snapping toward the source of the voice. Evelyn stepped back into the shadows, her parting words barely audible. "Think about it." James hesitated for a moment before turning and hurrying back toward the warehouse. Evelyn watched him go, the seed of doubt she had planted taking root. Evelyn lingered for a few more minutes, ensuring the coast was clear before approaching the van. Her flashlight illuminated the clipboard James had left on the driver's seat. The manifest listed the contents of the shipment: technical equipment, encrypted drives, and high-grade weapons. But it was the notes scribbled in the margins that caught her attention. One entry stood out: SC clearance required. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. SC, Shadow Council. The name she'd seen on the documents inside the warehouse. She flipped through the papers, her mind racing. The cryptic references, combined with the shipment's contents, painted a clear picture. The Black Vultures were just a front, a tool used by the Shadow Council to move resources and evade detection. The gang's local operations were a small cog in a far-reaching machine. Evelyn slipped the manifest into her bag and moved to the back of the van. She pried open a crate, revealing a set of encrypted communication devices. Each device bore a symbol she didn't recognize, but she snapped a photo for later analysis. Every piece of evidence pointed to a larger, more dangerous operation than she had anticipated. As Evelyn drove back to the ranch, her mind raced. The Shadow Council wasn't just a rumor or a distant threat. It was real, and its tendrils reached into Providence Springs. The Black Vultures were pawns, their actions guided by an unseen hand with global ambitions. She replayed her encounter with James in her mind. His hesitation, his conflict, it all suggested he wasn't fully committed to the gang. If she could sway him, he could be a valuable ally, someone who could provide insight into the gang's inner workings. The stakes had never been higher. Evelyn knew she couldn't take on the Shadow Council alone, but with the right strategy and the right allies, She could expose their operations and dismantle their network piece by piece. The fight was just beginning. And she was ready. The familiar hum of the ranch at night was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in Evelyn Carter's mind. She sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open and papers spread across the surface. The footage and documents she had gathered from the warehouse painted a grim picture. The Black Vultures weren't just a gang, they were pawns in a sophisticated international operation. Evelyn clicked through the files she had copied, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Images of coded manifests, communication logs, and financial records filled the screen. One name appeared over and over: Shadow Council. It was always vague, buried in cryptic references, but its presence was undeniable. Whoever they were, they wielded immense power. Her eyes narrowed as she focused on a series of encrypted messages. The language was technical, almost sterile, but the implications were clear. These weren't simple shipments, they were covert transfers of sensitive technology, weapons, and data. The Shadow Council was orchestrating a network that reached far beyond Providence Springs, manipulating events on a global scale. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about the gang anymore. It was about power, control, and the exploitation of systems too large for any one person to comprehend. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She wasn't fighting just a gang. She was stepping into a battle with an invisible enemy capable of shaping the world's future. The sound of boots on the wooden floor pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas entered the room, his face lined with concern. He paused when he saw the scattered papers and the intensity in her eyes. "You've been at this all night," he said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Evelyn gestured for him to sit, her tone serious. "I need you to see this." Thomas pulled out a chair and leaned forward as she began to explain. She walked him through the evidence, showing him the footage of the shipments, the manifests, and the coded messages. With each revelation, his expression grew darker. "The Black Vultures are just the beginning," Evelyn said. "They're moving high-grade equipment and classified information. This isn't just about making money. They're working for someone bigger, someone global." "The Shadow Council," Thomas murmured, the name heavy on his tongue. "Who are they?" Evelyn shook her head. "I don't know yet. But they're pulling the strings. Every shipment, every move the gang makes, it all traces back to them. They're using the vultures to keep their hands clean." Thomas rubbed his temples, trying to process the scope of it. "And you're planning to take them on?" Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't have a choice. If we don't stop this now, it's going to spread. People will get hurt." "Thomas, innocent people. This isn't just about the ranch anymore. It's about something much bigger." Thomas leaned back, exhaling deeply. "You know what this means, don't you? This isn't just a fight with a gang. This is going to be dangerous. For both of us." "I know," Evelyn said softly. "But if we don't stand up to them, who will?" For a moment, the room was silent. Then Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. We'll face this together." Evelyn squeezed his hand, gratitude flickering in her eyes. "Thank you. I'll need your help." As the night deepened, Evelyn began formulating her next steps. The evidence she had gathered wasn't enough to dismantle the Shadow Council, but it was a start. She needed more proof, more allies, and a way to expose the operation without endangering the people around her. She organized the documents into piles, separating the most critical pieces. Maps marked with drop-off points. Manifests tied to international shipments. And the cryptic messages mentioning SC formed the backbone of her case. She'd have to tread carefully. But the path forward was clear. As she prepared to lock the files away, her gaze fell on one final document, a list of names. Most of them were aliases, but a few stood out as legitimate identities. If she could trace these individuals, she might find a crack in the Shadow Council's armor. Evelyn closed the laptop and leaned back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for truth. For exposing the unseen forces manipulating lives from the shadows. And it was a fight she couldn't afford to lose. The first rays of dawn crept through the window as Evelyn stood on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The land stretched before her, quiet and unassuming, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. She tightened her grip on the cup of coffee in her hands, the warmth grounding her as she prepared for what lay ahead. Her resolve was unshakable. The Shadow Council might have power, but Evelyn had something they didn't: determination and a lifetime of experience in fighting those who thought they were untouchable. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Evelyn Carter crouched behind the tall oak tree, her breath steady as she peered through the dense foliage. In the clearing ahead, James sat on the hood of a rusted car, the faint glow of a cigarette illuminating his face. He was alone, his posture tense, and his eyes fixed on the ground. Evelyn had followed him here, to this secluded lot on the outskirts of town, knowing this was her best chance to confront him without interference. 4 days. She had studied James, observing the cracks in his composure, his hesitations during orders, his avoidance of eye contact with the senior gang members, all signs of a man caught in the crossfire of his own conscience. Tonight, she intended to exploit that conflict. Evelyn stepped out from the shadows, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. James's head snapped up, his hand instinctively moving to his side where a knife was sheathed. "Relax," Evelyn said, holding her hands out to show she meant no harm. "I'm not here to fight." James narrowed his eyes, his body still coiled with tension. "Who are you? What do you want?" "We've crossed paths before," Evelyn said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been watching you, James. I know you don't belong with the Black Vultures." James's expression hardened. "You don't know me, don't I?" Evelyn took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I see the way you hesitate when they give you orders, the way you keep your distance from the others. You're not like them, James. And you know it." His jaw tightened, and he turned his gaze away, the cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You don't understand what it's like. I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Evelyn said softly. "You just have to be brave enough to make it." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And do what? Walk away? They'd come after me. After my family. People don't just leave." Evelyn's voice took on a steely edge. "I'm not saying it will be easy, but staying will destroy you. You've seen what they do, the kind of people they are. You don't want that blood on your hands." For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. Finally, James crushed the cigarette under his boot and looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "Why do you care?" "Because I've been where you are," Evelyn said, her voice softening. "I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. I'm giving you a way out, James. A chance to do the right thing." Evelyn leaned against the rusted car as she began to share pieces of her story. I wasn't always living on a ranch, she started. Her gaze distant. I was a Federal Marshal. Spent years taking down people like the Black Vultures. Dangerous. Ruthless people who thought they were untouchable. James's eyes flickered with interest, though he tried to mask it. And now you're here? Why? Because I learned the hard way that the fight never really ends. Evelyn said. I've seen friends betrayed. Families torn apart. Lives ruined. I stepped away to protect what I had left. But now, the fight has found me again. James studied her, his skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. And you think I can help? I know you can, Evelyn said, her tone unwavering. You've seen their operations up close. You know their routines, their weaknesses. You can help me stop them. He shook his head. I'm just a prospect. I don't know much. You know more than you think, Evelyn countered. And anything you can tell me is a start. I'm not asking you to take them down yourself. I'm asking you to be my eyes and ears. In return, I'll make sure you're safe. James hesitated, the weight of her offer visible on his face. And if they find out? They won't, Evelyn assured him. I'll make sure of it. But you need to trust me. James, this is your chance to make a difference. He looked away, his hands clenching into fists. I'll think about it, he muttered. That's all I ask, Evelyn said, stepping back. But don't wait too long. Every day you stay, you're putting yourself in deeper danger. 2 days later, James showed up at a diner on the edge of town, where Evelyn had arranged a discreet meeting. He slid into the booth across from her, his expression guarded but resolute. I'll help you, he said without preamble. But I'm not risking everything for nothing. What's your plan? Evelyn nodded, respecting his directness. First, I need to understand their operations, how they communicate, where their supplies come from, and who's giving the orders. You don't have to tell me everything at once, just enough to start connecting the dots. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. They use burner phones. Each guy gets a new one every week, preloaded with numbers. The shipments coming through the Miller warehouse, but they're routed through smaller towns to avoid detection. And Romano, he's running the show here. But he's not the top dog. There's someone above him. Evelyn's ears perked at the last detail. Do you know who? James shook his head. No. But I've heard the name Marcus Drake a few times. I think he's connected. The name sent a chill through Evelyn. Marcus Drake was a ghost, a name whispered in the shadows of her past cases. If he was involved, the stakes were higher than she'd imagined. This is good, Evelyn said, her mind racing. This is the kind of intel that can make a difference. James frowned. You're really going to take them on, aren't you? Evelyn met his gaze, her expression steely. I don't have a choice. But I'm not doing it alone. You're part of this now. James. Together, we can take them down. For the first time, James's resolve seemed to solidify. He nodded, his doubt replaced by determination. Okay, let's do this. The streets of Providence Springs were quieter than usual, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the town square. Evelyn Carter leaned against her truck, her sharp eyes scanning the area. She didn't have to wait long. Vincent Romano's sleek black car pulled up in front of the diner, its polished exterior gleaming under the light. Romano stepped out, his tailored suit and confident swagger out of place in the rural town. He exchanged a few words with one of his men, then made his way toward the diner. Evelyn moved quickly, intercepting him on the sidewalk. "Romano," she called out. Her voice steady but edged with authority. He turned, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to thinly veiled curiosity. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, a hint of mockery in his tone. "What brings you to town?" Evelyn took a step closer, her gaze unflinching. "I think you know why I'm here." Romano's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "I'm afraid you'll have to enlighten me." "The warehouse," Evelyn said bluntly. "The shipments. The late-night deliveries. You're not exactly keeping a low profile." Romano's chuckle was low and humorless. "You've got quite the imagination. Maybe you should leave the detective work to the professionals." "Oh, I'm not imagining anything," Evelyn shot back. "I've seen what you're moving through that warehouse. And I know you're not acting alone." The smile slipped from Romano's face. He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Careful, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low warning. "You don't want to make enemies you can't handle." Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, her voice dropping to matches. "You should be careful, too. It'd be a shame if someone in your organization decided you were more trouble than you're worth." For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in Romano's eyes. Evelyn had struck a nerve, and she knew it. She straightened, her tone hardening. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. And if you don't start cleaning up your mess, someone else will." Romano's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk. "Enjoy your little crusade while it lasts," he said. "It's not going to end the way you think." With that, he turned and walked into the diner, leaving Evelyn standing on the sidewalk. She watched him go, her mind racing. Romano was rattled, but it wasn't enough. She needed more leverage. Back at the ranch, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open to the files she'd taken from the warehouse. One name kept appearing in the coded communications: Marcus Drake. The name was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. She searched through the files, piecing together fragments of information. Drake was connected to the shipments, but his role was shrouded in secrecy. What little she could find painted a picture of a man operating in the shadows, orchestrating operations on a global scale. He was a ghost. His name whispered in high-level intelligence circles, but rarely confirmed. Evelyn leaned back, her mind working through the implications. If Marcus Drake was involved, it meant the Black Vultures weren't just a regional problem. They were a cog in a much larger machine, one that reached far beyond Providence Springs. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Thomas walked in, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What V you got?" he asked, nodding toward the laptop. "A name," Evelyn replied. "Marcus Drake. He's tied to the shipments, and I think he's the one pulling the strings." Thomas frowned. "What do you know about him?" "Not much," Evelyn admitted. "But his name keeps coming up in connection with high-level operations. Weapons, technology, classified intel. He's involved in all of it. If we're going to take down the Shadow Council, we need to start with him." Thomas nodded slowly. "So what's the plan?" "I need more information," Evelyn said. "And I think James can help." That evening, Evelyn met James in the same secluded lot where they'd first spoken. He arrived on foot, his posture tense but his resolve evident. "What do you have for me?" Evelyn asked as he approached. James pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to her. "It's a message I intercepted," he said. "They were careless. Left it out during a meeting. It's coded, but I'm pretty sure it's about the next shipment." Evelyn unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the cryptic text. It was filled with numbers and abbreviations. But one phrase stood out: council approval required. Her breath caught. This was it, proof that the Shadow Council was directly involved in the Black Vulture's operations. "This is good," Evelyn said, her tone serious. "It's the kind of intel that can make a difference." James hesitated. "You really think you can take them down?" Evelyn met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I don't have a choice. But with your help, I know we can." James nodded, his doubt giving way to determination. "Then let's do it." As he walked away, Evelyn stood in the fading light, the paper clenched in her hand. The path ahead was dangerous, but she had taken the first steps. The Shadow Council's days of operating in the dark were numbered. The city skyline shimmered in the night as Evelyn Carter parked her car 2 blocks away from the towering office building. The air was crisp, and the quiet hum of distant traffic provided a soundtrack to her preparations. William Crawford, the Deputy Director of National Intelligence, was hiding more than government secrets. Tonight, Evelyn intended to uncover the truth he guarded so fiercely. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying her tools, Evelyn moved quickly through the shadows, approaching the rear entrance of the building. She had spent days studying the building's security, rotating guards, motion sensors, and camera angles. Timing was everything. The guard at the back door took his routine smoke break at 10:15 p.m., leaving her a narrow window to bypass the lock. She crouched by the door as the guard stepped away, her hands steady as she worked her lock-picking tools. Within seconds, the lock clicked open, and Evelyn slipped inside. The quiet hum of the building's climate control system greeted her as she moved swiftly through the corridor. She kept close to the walls, avoiding the glow of overhead lights. Evelyn reached the elevator bank and pulled out a device from her bag, plugging it into the service panel. She bypassed the elevator's standard controls, ensuring it wouldn't register her presence. She selected the top floor, where Crawford's private office was located. The elevator doors slid open silently, revealing a hallway lined with glass walls. Evelyn stepped out, her movements precise as she approached Crawford's office. The heavy oak door was imposing, but she wasn't deterred. She pulled out a second device, one designed to decrypt digital locks, and attached it to the keypad. The device worked quickly, and within moments, the lock disengaged. Evelyn slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Crawford's office was everything she had expected: sleek, modern, and meticulously organized. A large desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by bookshelves filled with classified binders and nondescript file boxes. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city, but Evelyn's focus was on the information that lay hidden within these walls. She moved to the desk, her gloved hands quickly scanning the surface for anything useful. A laptop sat in the center, its screen locked. Evelyn connected her flash drive, launching a program to copy its files and decrypt its contents. While the software worked, she turned her attention to the filing cabinets. One drawer was locked, but a quick application of her tools remedied that. Inside, she found documents marked with the Shadow Council's emblem, a simple, ominous circle with 3 interlocking lines. Her breath quickened as she flipped through the pages. Shipment logs, coded communications, and detailed dossiers on international operations filled the folders. The Council's reach was vast, spanning continents and infiltrating governments. As she worked, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. The steps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. Evelyn moved quickly, taking cover behind the desk as the door opened. William Crawford entered, His phone pressed to his ear. "No. I'm telling you. We can't delay the shipment," he said. His tone clipped. "The council expects results. And I won't be the one explaining why we're behind schedule." Evelyn waited until he ended the call and set the phone on the desk. Then she stepped out of the shadows. Her voice calm but firm. "Expecting someone else?" Crawford spun around, his face paling at the sight of her. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's had enough of your games," Evelyn replied, keeping her stance steady. "We need to talk." Crawford's initial shock gave way to indignation. "You're making a mistake. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Evelyn smirked. "That's what I'm here to find out." She stepped forward, her voice hardening. "The Shadow Council. I know you're part of it. I know about the shipments, the coded messages. I have enough evidence to blow this operation wide open. Now, you're going to tell me everything." Crawford's eyes darted to the laptop, where her flash drive was still copying files. He lunged for it. But Evelyn was faster. She shoved him back into the chair, her tone sharp. "Don't make me repeat myself. You don't understand," Crawford said, his voice trembling now. "The council isn't just some rogue group. They're everywhere. They have people in governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. You can't fight them. Watch me." Evelyn snapped. "Start talking." Crawford hesitated, his arrogance replaced by fear. "The council, they're not just about power. They're about control. Every war, every election, every major event, they're behind it. The shipments you found are part of a larger plan. They're moving technology, weapons, and intelligence to destabilize regions and solidify their influence." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Who runs it? Who's giving the orders?" Crawford shook his head. "No one knows. The council's leadership is hidden, even from its members. But there are 3 key players overseeing the operations: Devon, Chen, and Reznikov. They're the ones coordinating everything." Evelyn absorbed the names, her mind already forming a plan. "Where can I find them?" Crawford hesitated again, but the look in Evelyn's eyes told him she wasn't bluffing. "There's a meeting scheduled in 2 weeks, in a state outside of Berlin. It's their next coordination summit." Evelyn stepped back, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her tone laced with irony. "You've been very helpful." She retrieved her flash drive and moved toward the door. Crawford called after her, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't understand. If you go after them, they'll come for you. They'll destroy everything you care about." Evelyn paused, her hand on the doorknob. "They already tried. Now it's my turn." As Evelyn drove away from the building, the weight of Crawford's revelations settled over her. The Shadow Council wasn't just a distant threat, it was a global force capable of reshaping the world. But she had something they didn't: their weakness. The meeting in Berlin would be her chance to strike. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over yet. The sun had barely risen when Evelyn Carter spread out the documents she'd taken from William Crawford's office across the dining table at the ranch. The files were a jigsaw puzzle of cryptic messages, maps, and coded coordinates. But Evelyn's sharp mind was already assembling the pieces. Crawford's admission about the Shadow Council's upcoming summit was a breakthrough. The estate outside Berlin wasn't just a meeting location, it was a hub of operations. Her notes showed a network of supply chains converging there, confirming the council's influence extended across continents. Evelyn's phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was James. "You find anything?" she asked, answering quickly. Plenty. James replied. Romano's doubling security at the warehouse. They've got a big shipment coming in 2 days. And they're on edge about it. Does he know about Crawford? James paused. I don't think so. But he's suspicious of everyone. The gang's nervous. Evelyn. Something big is going on. Evelyn made a note in the margin of her map. Good work. Keep your head down. I'll handle it from here. Be careful. James said. Romano doesn't forgive loose ends. Evelyn ended the call. Her mind racing. The warehouse shipment and the council summit were connected. If she could disrupt their logistics, it might delay the council's plans and buy her time to strike at their leadership. She leaned back, staring at the map. The stakes were higher than ever. But Evelyn knew she couldn't afford to hesitate. This wasn't just about stopping a gang or even exposing a corrupt council. It was about dismantling a machine that thrived on chaos and control. As Evelyn reviewed her strategy, her phone buzzed again. The number was unknown. But something about it made her stomach tighten. She hesitated, then answered. Evelyn Carter, a deep, distorted voice said. You've been busy. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A friend, the voice replied. But you've made enemies. Evelyn. Powerful ones. What do you want? She demanded. The voice chuckled. Low and menacing. It's not about what I want. It's about what you'll do. If you want your husband back, you'll stop your little crusade. Evelyn's heart stopped. What did you do? Robert's safe. For now, the voice said. But if you push any further, he won't be. This is your warning. Evelyn. Walk away. The line went dead. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing. Fear and anger surged through her in equal measure. She grabbed her keys and headed for the truck, her hands trembling as she started the engine. Whoever had taken Robert wasn't bluffing. She needed to act fast. Robert Carter sat in a dimly lit room, his wrists bound and his head pounding from the blow that had knocked him out hours earlier. The air smelled of damp concrete and gasoline. He strained against the ropes, but they held tight. Two men stood near the door, their leather jackets marking them as black vultures. One leaned against the wall, flipping a knife lazily in his hand. The other paced, his boots echoing against the floor. You think she'll come for him? The one with the knife asked. Of course, the other replied. That's the point. We'll flush her out. Make her think she's got no choice but to play by our rules. Robert glared at them. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The man with the knife smirked. Neither do you. She's got one shot to save you. Old man. If she blows it. Well, he let the sentence hang, the blade glinting as he spun it again. Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew Evelyn would come for him, but he also knew she wouldn't walk into a trap blindly. She'd find a way to turn the tables. Back at the ranch, Evelyn reviewed the files one last time before packing her bag. Every instinct told her to rush in and save Robert, but she knew better. This wasn't just about him anymore. The Shadow Council had made their move, and she couldn't afford to play into their hands. She pulled out a map and marked the locations tied to the Black Vultures. If they had Robert, he'd likely be held at one of their safe houses. James's intel had mentioned a remote cabin outside of town, isolated, secure, and perfect for a hostage situation. Evelyn loaded her gear into the truck, her mind racing. She'd save Robert, but she'd do it on her terms. The council had underestimated her, and she intended to make them regret it. As she started the engine, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about rescuing her husband. It was about sending a message. Evelyn Carter wasn't backing down. The fight was only beginning. Evelyn Carter studied the blueprints spread across the table in her dimly lit room. Every line and annotation burned into her mind. The Berlin estate, nestled within an expansive forest on the city's outskirts, was more fortress than mansion. High walls, infrared cameras, and a network of patrolling guards protected its secrets. For most people, it was impenetrable. But Evelyn wasn't most people. James sat across from her. His brow furrowed as he tapped a pen against his notebook. They're not taking any chances. Double patrols at the main gate and motion detectors along the southern wall. The estate's ballroom is where the council will meet. Security will be tightest there. Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. What about the service entrance? One guard and a biometric scanner. It's our best shot, James said, pointing to the blueprint. Once we're inside, you'll need to stick to the staff corridors. They're off the main grid, so the cameras won't track you as closely. Evelyn leaned back, the weight of the mission pressing against her chest. What about Drake? James's jaw tightened. He'll be there. From what I've heard, he rarely attends these meetings in person. This is big. Bigger than they've let on. Evelyn muttered. Her fingers traced the path they would take. Every move calculated. If Drake's involved, they're planning something global. We can't let this meeting happen without exposing them. James hesitated. Are you sure about this? Once we're in, there's no turning back. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steely. There never was. Under the cover of darkness, Evelyn and James approached the estate. The forest surrounding the property provided ample cover. But the closer they got, the more oppressive the air felt. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, though her breathing remained steady. Years of training had taught her to control her nerves. The service entrance was as James had described, a narrow, well-lit path leading to a steel door. A lone guard stood outside, his posture rigid. Evelyn motioned for James to stay back as she moved closer, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. The guard barely had time to register her presence before she struck. A quick jab to his pressure point rendered him unconscious. Evelyn dragged him into the shadows, her movements swift and efficient. James joined her, pulling out a device to bypass the biometric scanner. Give me 30 seconds, he whispered, his fingers flying over the keypad. The scanner beeped softly, and the door unlocked with a hiss. They slipped inside, the cool air of the corridor greeting them. The hum of distant machinery filled the silence as they moved through the staff corridors. Evelyn's sharp eyes scanned every corner, her senses on high alert. They passed storage rooms and utility closets, each one a potential hiding spot if things went south. At one point, the sound of footsteps echoed nearby. Evelyn pressed James against the wall, holding her breath as two guards passed by, their radios crackling softly. When the coast was clear, she released him and gestured for him to follow. The estate's grandeur became evident as they reached the main hallways. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers, and ornate paintings adorned the walls. Evelyn's focus never wavered, but she couldn't ignore the stark contrast between the opulence and the darkness it concealed. They reached a narrow staircase that led to a balcony overlooking the ballroom. From their vantage point, Evelyn could see the Shadow Council's members gathering below. Men and women in tailored suits and designer dresses mingled, their conversations masked by the soft hum of a string quartet. There he is, James whispered, nodding toward the center of the room. Marcus Drake stood apart from the crowd, his sharp features and commanding presence impossible to miss. He wore a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, his piercing gaze scanning the room. Evelyn's jaw tightened. This was the man orchestrating the chaos she'd been fighting against. The man responsible for countless lives ruined in the name of power. "We need to get closer," she said. James hesitated. "What about Robert?" Evelyn's heart sank. She had almost allowed herself to forget the personal stakes. "Do you have a location?" "They're holding him in one of the guest rooms," James said. "Second floor. East wing. But security's tighter there." Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't risk exposing herself too soon. But she couldn't leave Robert in danger either. "You get to him," she said. "I'll handle Drake." James looked at her, his expression torn. "Are you sure?" "We don't have a choice," Evelyn replied. "Go." James nodded reluctantly and disappeared down the staircase, leaving Evelyn alone. She turned her attention back to the ballroom, her resolve hardening. The Shadow Council had thrived in the dark for too long. Tonight, she would bring their secrets into the light. Evelyn moved along the balcony, her eyes fixed on Drake. He spoke with a group of council members, his demeanor calm but commanding. Evelyn's hand brushed against the pistol at her side, her fingers itching to act. But this wasn't the time for impulsive moves. She needed to know more, their plans, their network, their weaknesses. As she observed, a sudden commotion near the ballroom entrance drew her attention. 2 black vultures entered, escorting a man whose head was covered with a hood. Evelyn's stomach twisted. It was Robert. Her grip on the balcony rail tightened as the bikers led Robert to a side room, their movements careful but forceful. Evelyn's breathing quickened. The stakes had just escalated, and every second counted. She turned back to Drake, her mind torn between pursuing him and rescuing Robert. The council's web of power loomed over her like a storm cloud. But her husband's life hung by a thread. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly vulnerable. But vulnerability wouldn't stop her. It never had. With a final glance at Drake, Evelyn slipped away from the balcony. Her path set. She would rescue Robert, dismantle the council, and confront Marcus Drake. The night was far from over, and the fight had only just begun. The council's meeting room was a spectacle of excess: high ceilings, gilded chandeliers, and a table large enough to seat the most powerful manipulators of the modern world. Evelyn Carter slipped into the shadows along the edge of the room, her eyes scanning the figures seated around the table. At the head of the gathering, Vincent Romano stood, his presence commanding attention as he detailed the next phase of the council's operations. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The moment she'd prepared for was at hand. She moved closer, her footsteps muffled by the ornate rug beneath her. Romano gestured at a screen displaying a map of global supply routes. Evelyn memorized the lines and arrows connecting key locations before stepping into the light. "Romano," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The room fell silent, and all heads turned toward her. Romano's confident smirk faltered as recognition dawned. "You," he snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon holstered at his side. Evelyn was faster. In a fluid motion, she drew her pistol, training it on him. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice steady. Romano hesitated but complied, the metallic clatter of his gun hitting the floor echoing in the room. "You think you can walk in here and stop this?" he said, his tone a mix of bravado and desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Why don't you enlighten me?" Evelyn countered, her eyes narrowing. Romano's gaze darted to the other council members, who remained frozen in their seats. "You won't get out of here alive," he warned. "That's not your concern right now," Evelyn said. "Tell me about Drake. What's his endgame? Romano's lips curled into a sneer. Drake doesn't have an endgame. He has a beginning, one that will reshape the world. You think you can stop him? You're already too late. Evelyn stepped closer, the barrel of her pistol steady. What's happening tonight? Spill it. Or I'll find someone else who will. Romano's bravado cracked under her glare. The shipments, they're diversions, he admitted. Drake's real target is the Geneva summit. He plans to use the chaos we've created to force governments to bow to his control. Before Evelyn could press further, a sudden explosion shattered the silence. The room erupted into chaos as smoke filled the air. And Romano lunged for his weapon. Evelyn reacted instinctively, kicking the gun across the floor before tackling him. The two grappled briefly before Romano broke free and fled through a side door. Evelyn cursed under her breath and gave chase, her determination overriding the sting of smoke in her lungs. Evelyn's pursuit of Romano was cut short when her earpiece crackled to life. James's urgent voice came through. Evelyn, I found Robert. He's in the East Wing. But they've got reinforcements heading his way. Evelyn's heart lurched. She changed direction, sprinting through the labyrinthine halls toward the East Wing. Guards emerged from doorways, but she dispatched them with practiced efficiency, a sweep of the leg here, a precise blow to the temple there. Time was against her, and every second counted. She reached the East Wing and spotted two black vultures outside a reinforced door. They hadn't seen her yet, giving her the advantage. Evelyn pulled a flashbang from her belt, yanked the pin, and tossed it toward them. The grenade detonated with a deafening bang, disorienting the guards long enough for her to close the distance. The first guard barely registered her presence before her elbow struck his jaw, knocking him unconscious. The second raised his weapon, but Evelyn disarmed him with a twist of his wrist and a well-placed knee to his stomach. He crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. Evelyn pushed through the door to find Robert bound to a chair, his face bruised but his eyes sharp with defiance. He looked up as she entered, relief washing over his features. Took you long enough, he said, his voice hoarse. You're lucky, I'm good at multitasking, Evelyn quipped, cutting through his restraints. Robert stood shakily, and Evelyn handed him a pistol. Can you fight? Do I have a choice? He asked, his grip tightening around the weapon. Not really, Evelyn admitted. Stay close. The two moved cautiously through the corridor, Evelyn leading the way as Robert covered their rear. They encountered more guards, but their combined efforts kept the path clear. The tension was palpable, each step bringing them closer to safety in the final confrontation. The estate's control room was a stark contrast to the rest of the opulent mansion. Banks of monitors displayed live feeds from security cameras, while operators worked furiously to regain control after the earlier explosion. Standing in the center of the chaos was Marcus Drake, his calm demeanor an unsettling contrast to the turmoil around him. Evelyn entered the room, her weapon raised. Drake, she said, her voice cold. Drake turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Ms. Carter, I've been expecting you. You've caused enough damage, Evelyn said, stepping closer. It ends tonight. Drake smirked. You think taking me down will stop this? The Shadow Council isn't one man. It's an idea. A force. You can't kill that. Watch me, Evelyn said, her finger tightening on the trigger. Drake raised a hand, gesturing to the monitors. Look around you. Every one of those screens shows a piece of the world we control. Economies, governments, technology. You're fighting a war you can't win. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. Maybe, but I'm going to make sure you lose. Before she could fire, Drake lunged at her, knocking the gun from her hands. The two grappled, their movements a blur of strikes and counters. Drake's strength was matched by Evelyn's precision, each blow calculated to exploit his weaknesses. The fight ended with Evelyn pinning Drake against the console, her knife pressed to his throat. "Where's the failsafe?" she demanded. Drake's eyes gleamed with defiance. "You'll never find it in time." Evelyn's knife pressed harder. "Try me." Drake hesitated, then gestured to a hidden panel on the console. Evelyn activated it, revealing a series of controls tied to the console's network. She quickly initiated a shutdown sequence, the monitors flickering as their systems were disabled one by one. Drake laughed, even as his empire crumbled. "You may have won tonight, but the council will rise again. You can't stop progress." Evelyn stepped back, her gaze cold. Progress doesn't leave bodies in its wake. With one final blow, she knocked him unconscious and secured him with zip ties. The room fell silent, the council's power gridlocked for the first time in decades. Evelyn exhaled, her body aching but her resolve unbroken. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, she had delivered a crushing blow. The Shadow Council had underestimated her, and now they would face the consequences. The estate grounds were in chaos. The sound of helicopters overhead and sirens wailing in the distance signaled that Evelyn's final play had begun to unfold. Reinforcements were coming, but she had one last objective to complete before leaving the battlefield behind. Evelyn and Robert made their way through the wreckage of what had once been the Shadow Council's stronghold. The control room systems were disabled, and Marcus Drake, bound and unconscious, had been left for the authorities to claim. The council's key members were either scattered or captured in the confusion. Still, Evelyn couldn't afford to relax. The council's influence ran deep, and she needed to ensure their network was dismantled. In the control room, Evelyn returned to the console where the council's network shutdown sequence had been initiated. A cluster of screens flickered faintly, showing signs of partial recovery. She worked quickly, inserting her final decryption tool into the system. The program accessed files buried deep in the council's encrypted archives, pulling data that would expose their global reach. "We need to get this to the authorities," Robert said, his voice strained but steady. "We will," Evelyn replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "But first, I'm sending it to trusted contacts outside the usual channels. If we rely on the official route, too much will get buried." Robert nodded, trusting her judgment. Evelyn's list of allies, journalists, independent investigators, and former colleagues were handpicked for their integrity and tenacity. Within minutes, she had transmitted a trove of evidence, ensuring the council's shadowy dealings would be laid bare for the world to see. "It's done," Evelyn said, stepping back from the console. "Their power is broken. For now," Robert cautioned. "They'll try to regroup." "Let them try," Evelyn said, her gaze hardening. "This time, the world will be watching." As they exited the estate, the first wave of law enforcement arrived. Evelyn and Robert stood together, watching as agents moved to secure the area. For the first time in hours, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of stillness. "You didn't have to come for me," Robert said softly, breaking the silence. Evelyn turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Yes, I did." He chuckled, the sound tinged with relief. "You always were stubborn, and you always underestimated me," Evelyn teased, her tone light despite the weight of what they had just endured. Robert reached for her hand, and she allowed the brief comfort of his touch. "Thank you," Evelyn. For everything. We're not done yet, she said. Her voice steady. But we've won this battle. They stood together as the estate's gates swung open, revealing a convoy of vehicles ready to take over the operation. The weight of their fight wasn't lost on either of them. But for now, they had each other. Weeks later, Evelyn sat on the porch of their ranch, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. Robert was nearby, fixing the fencing that had taken a beating during a recent storm. It felt surreal to be home after everything they had faced. But the fight lingered in Evelyn's mind. The Shadow Council's operations had been exposed, and the fallout was monumental. Governments across the globe launched investigations. Arrests were made, and their network was in shambles. Still, Evelyn knew it wasn't the end. Power, like water, always found a way to flow. She picked up the letter resting on the table beside her. It was from one of her trusted contacts, confirming that additional files she had sent were now public. The world was watching, just as she had hoped. Evelyn exhaled, a sense of calm washing over her. They had achieved what many thought impossible. Justice, however fleeting, had prevailed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. The fight wasn't over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The world awoke to headlines that could no longer be ignored. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and digital platforms exploded with revelations of the Shadow Council's sinister operations. Evelyn Carter's painstakingly gathered evidence had been released to trusted journalists and international watchdog organizations, sparking a global reckoning. Names of council members, detailed financial transactions, and footage from the Berlin estate now painted an undeniable picture of corruption and manipulation. In Washington, the Secretary of Defense resigned in disgrace as connections to the Shadow Council's illegal arms trade surfaced. Across the Atlantic, a European Union official faced questioning over his role in facilitating covert intelligence theft. The public outcry was immediate and unforgiving, with citizens demanding accountability and systemic change. Governments scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout, launching investigations and issuing arrests. Protests filled the streets of major cities, the chants of anger and determination a chorus against the hidden powers that had controlled their lives for too long. Meanwhile, independent agencies such as Transparency International and Amnesty Global worked alongside investigative journalists to trace the Council's vast network. Evelyn's files revealed a web that spanned continents, implicating corporations, political leaders, and even non-governmental organizations. The ripple effect was seismic, and it became clear that the Council's reach had infiltrated the highest levels of power. From her quiet vantage point at the ranch, Evelyn watched the world begin to tear apart the darkness she had exposed. Her chest tightened as she saw the faces of people who had unknowingly suffered under the Council's influence. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a moment of pride. Justice was no longer a distant dream, it was happening in real time. The sound of boots on the porch pulled Evelyn from her thoughts. Robert stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. He held a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. "You're all over the news," he said, handing her the paper. Evelyn glanced at the front page. Her name wasn't mentioned, she had made sure of that, but the articles were a direct result of her work. The headlines spoke of unprecedented exposure and the downfall of a secretive cabal. "It's a start," she said, taking a sip of the coffee. Robert sat beside her, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. "You did it, Evelyn. You took them down." "Not all of them," she replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The Council's network is vast. Some pieces will slip through the cracks. The morning sun bathed the ranch in a warm, golden light as Evelyn Carter stood on the porch, staring out at the rolling fields that stretched to the horizon. The quiet hum of the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird were a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. Yet, despite the serenity, her mind was far from calm. The weight of her journey pressed against her chest. She thought of the friends she had lost over the years, allies who had stood by her in the pursuit of justice, only to fall victim to the Shadow Council's ruthless reach. Their faces lingered in her memory, vivid and painful. The scars on her body told stories of battles won. But the deeper wounds, the ones hidden from view, spoke of sacrifices and regrets. Evelyn ran a hand along the wooden railing of the porch, her fingers tracing the grooves and imperfections. She had built this place with Robert, pouring her hope and determination into every nail and plank. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a haven far removed from the dangers of her past. But that past had found her, forcing her to confront it head-on. "You've done it," she murmured to herself. "You've torn them apart." Yet the victory felt hollow. Justice had come at a steep cost, and the scars she bore were a testament to the price she had paid. The Shadow Council's network might be dismantled, but their remnants would undoubtedly try to rise again. Evelyn knew better than to believe this was truly the end. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat at the dining table, a pile of unopened letters in front of her. Among them was one that stood out, a plain envelope with no return address. Her instincts prickled as she opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief but chilling. "The council is not dead. Be ready." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. But the words carried weight. She folded the paper carefully and set it aside, her mind racing. The fight wasn't over. It never truly was. Robert entered the room, his brow furrowed as he noticed her expression. "Something wrong?" he asked. Evelyn handed him the letter. As he read it, his jaw tightened. "You think it's real?" "Probably," she said. "They'll regroup. Maybe not as the Shadow Council, but in some other form. People like them don't just vanish." Robert set the letter down, his gaze meeting hers. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the table. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to step away, let someone else handle it. But that's not who you are." Robert finished for her. She smiled faintly. "No, it's not. I just need to figure out what comes next." Robert reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Always." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn found herself sitting by the fire pit, the flames casting dancing shadows on her face. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill of uncertainty that had settled in her chest. Her thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her here. From her days as a Federal Marshal to her battle against the Shadow Council, every step had shaped her into the woman she was now. The path had been fraught with danger and loss, but it had also been filled with moments of triumph and purpose. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, her words soft but firm. "I've spent my life chasing justice, walking into the dark corners others feared to tread. I've seen the worst of humanity and the strength it takes to stand against it." She stared into the flames, her reflection shimmering in the flickering light. "Every choice I've made has come with a cost. Friends lost, scars earned, and a part of me forever changed. But I've never regretted it. Not once." Evelyn paused, the weight of her words settling around her. "The world isn't perfect. It never will be. But as long as people like them exist, those who exploit, manipulate, and destroy, there will always be people like me to stop them." She stood, her resolve hardening like steel. The fight isn't over. It never is. But I'm ready for whatever comes next. The fire crackled as Evelyn turned her gaze to the horizon, where the first stars began to appear. Her journey wasn't ending, it was evolving. And as long as there was a fight to be fought, Evelyn Carter would be there, standing firm in the face of darkness. But the ones that matter are being held accountable, Robert said, his tone firm. And that's because of you. Evelyn turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. We both know this fight isn't over. There are still those who won't let this go without a response. Robert's expression darkened. Do you think they'll come after us? They'll try, Evelyn admitted. But I've faced worse. We'll be ready. Robert reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Just promise me you'll be careful. Evelyn nodded. Always. Later that evening, Evelyn met with James in a quiet corner of the diner on the edge of town. The atmosphere was subdued, the faint hum of the jukebox blending with the low murmur of other patrons. James's face was less tense than she had seen it in weeks, but there was still a shadow of uncertainty in his eyes. You're leaving, Evelyn said as she slid into the booth across from him. James nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. I need a clean break. What we did, it changed things for me. I can't go back to the life I had with the Black Vultures. But staying here isn't an option either. Where will you go? Evelyn asked. Not sure yet, James admitted. But I'll figure it out. Somewhere far from all of this. Somewhere I can start fresh. Evelyn studied him for a moment before reaching into her jacket pocket. She slid an envelope across the table. Consider this a head start, she said. James hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a stack of cash and a slip of paper with a name and address. What's this? He asked. A contact of mine, Evelyn replied. They'll help you get settled. No questions asked. James's throat tightened, and he nodded. Thank you. For everything. Evelyn reached across the table, placing a hand on his. You earned this, James. You stood up when it mattered. Don't forget that. They sat in silence for a moment before James rose to leave. He hesitated at the door, turning back to offer her a small smile. Evelyn watched him go, knowing this was the last time their paths would cross. The world outside the diner was still spinning, chaotic and relentless. But for James, and for Evelyn, a small piece of justice had been reclaimed. Evelyn's story ends, but the fight against corruption never truly does. What would you do if faced with the same choice? Leave your thoughts in the comments, your perspective could inspire others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.